Hello guys, welcome to my new video, and today we'll be looking at the summary of the world first Mythic race. And congratulations to Method, who just took down a Mythic version of Jaina encounter, and Jaina looks extremely fun in terms of healer perspective, because if we look at some of the last minutes of the boss encounter and just look at the healing meters, or at least look at the HP bars of players, it is insane to see this much of damage happening. And Method end up using the Zerg tactic, where they kind of avoided or didn't kill the elementals. They're trying to pump out as much damage as possible. You can see all of the crazy healing cooldowns here going on. Damage reduction was the king for Mythic Jaina encounter. You see 2 Resto Shamans, you'll see Spirit Links, you see barriers happening there. So congratulations to Method for getting the world first, and this video is going to be looking at the best classes, or at least the composition for the best Mythic Plus, or at least the Mythic raiding guilds. We'll be looking at the best tanks, the best DPS, and the best healers, and we'll be looking at guilds like Method Limit, guilds like Exorsus, upcoming guilds like Pieces, and things like Wildcard Gaming, who became extremely popular through streaming services like Twitch during this Mythic World First race. So we'll be looking at the different characters, at the different classes that were really popular. Now, some of the sweeping statements and some of the disclaimers, if the classes are not listed here, it does not mean that they're terrible. It just means that at that 1%, and we're talking at that 1% of the World of Warcraft population, the players determined these classes not to be the most optimal for this specific fight. Another sweeping statement about the whole Battle of Dazar'alor. This dungeon overall had a similar pattern to maybe on Taurus back in the day, where majority of the bosses, let's say 8 out of 9 of the bosses, were quite easy in terms of, or at least how these Mythic players perceived them, because if you look at some of the wipe counts, you'll notice that most of the guilds didn't struggle that much to get 8 Mythic bosses down, and Jaina was, I think Method used like 340 or 350 tries on them, and I see a lot of guilds using 300, 400, 500 tries on Jaina, while all the other bosses were, some of them were 5 tries, some of them were 20. Method did kinda struggle with Megatorque with I think around 50 wipes, but that's another deal. So overall, a lot of these bosses for the best players in the world were quite easy, except for the last boss. So class stacking or class balance doesn't really come into effect until the last 3 bosses, Megatorque, Blockade, and Jaina, where certain boss mechanics definitely favored, let's say to some extent, ranged, favored certain tanks, favored certain healers. So we'll talk about them. We'll start off with tanks, guys, and tanks have really kind of had a different variety shift. So first of all, Method ended up using a combo for most of their boss skills, and that was Brewmaster Monk and a Prot Warrior. Now, Brewmaster Monk is no surprise to be in the top, because Brewmaster, a lot of people will perceive as Brewmasters as one of the best raiding tanks because of the stagger mechanic. Just the whole component, the class fantasy of stagger mechanic works so well for Mythic World First races, because first of all, you're probably doing content when you might not have the best gear, so you're kind of under budgeted, and stagger works really well preventing those spike HP drops and making sure your tank doesn't die. So Brewmasters overall, even though they received a nerf in 8.1, they're still one of the best tanks, and all of the guilds mentioned here used some combination of Brewmasters throughout this whole raid. So it shows you how strong. Prot Warriors are one of the emerging tanks, where Prot Warriors received a pretty big buffs in 8.1, and all of a sudden a lot of people will consider Prot Warriors as being really strong at damage mitigation when it comes to physical damage. Of course, they kind of fall down when there's magic damage, when there's dot damage and things like that. But overall, Prot Warriors were picked and were used for some of the world first skills. So if you're Prot Warrior, you're probably happy right now. If we look at Limit's composition, it was a bit weirder or more unorthodox pick with double Prot Paladins. Now, there's nothing wrong with Prot Paladins. Prot Paladins to some extent were the MVPs, or the most upcoming tank, and we'll talk about that later on. But they went with double Prot Paladins, and they used that for a lot of the fights. Exorsus went, at least with a ladder progression, they went with double Blood DKs, and there is nothing wrong with Blood DKs, because Blood DKs were the MVPs for Megatorque. Anytime there's going to be any kind of ad management needed, where you need to displace ads, you need to pull ads, where ads play a huge part of boss mechanics, Blood DKs are extremely strong. Single grip, mass grip, really good. Self-healing, really strong as well. So a lot of the guilds, actually most of the guilds that I mentioned here, went with 2 blood decays for Megatorque, at least a combination of some blood decays for Blockade as well. Blockade was a very different fight in terms of preferring range DPS, but we'll talk about that later on. And things like Pieces, guilds like Wildcard Gaming, a lot of them went with combinations of Prot Paladins, combinations of Brewmaster Monks, and things like that, and they kind of swapped around. Now, the first time we saw some sort of class stacking is Opulence, and Opulence is not a particularly hard fight, but it does have a mechanic called Coin Shower, which happens at the last phase. It's physical damage. It can be bopped. It can be completely removed. It's basically going to one-shot a person if they don't stack. If they stack, that damage is going to be spread across everybody, but you can just bop the person runs out the raid, and nothing actually happens. Mechanic completely avoided. So Paladins, not particularly, like, it doesn't have to be a Prot Paladin, but a lot of people did end up using multiple Prot Paladins to kind of give out bops and things like that, and it was extremely strong. To some extent, Prot Paladins were again kind of shining in King Rastakhan, where you were able to use things like Blessing of Spell Warding to avoid Meteor Leap, which is actually nature damage, and you can actually avoid it completely by placing Spell Warding on the target. It's not a completely vital mechanic. You can avoid it usually by just stacking again. So it's not that big of a deal, but it's kind of like a, you know, Prot Paladin has so much utility, so many of these little things that can really bring them up in terms of, you know, the overall strength. So that's why I have to mention that if we look at some of the class balance in terms of tanks, there was a wide variety. Prot Warriors are viable in Mythic World First skills. Prot Paladins were used quite a lot. Again, no surprise, no Guardian Druids, no Vengeance Demon Hunters. I don't think there's been any single World First kill with the Vengeance Demon Hunter since whether Legion or BfA. Vengeance Demon Hunters at the very top end Mythic World First content, they're just not there. They're just not there right now, and it's really sad to see to some extent. Guardian Druids, there's no changes being made to Guardian Druids, there's no changes being made to Vengeance Demon Hunters, and I think a lot of people are kind of asking for more buffs towards those raid encounters. We didn't see any of those tanking classes in that, you know, top end kills. My summary: Brewmasters, extremely strong survivability. Blood Decays were used for specific fights where there was single grip, mass grip. Again, their self-healing is really strong. Prot Paladin, one of the kings of utility. They provide so much utility in terms of different abilities they can have that mitigate mechanics completely. And again, Prot Warriors can be really, really strong for certain fights as well. So those were one of the strongest and one of the most used tanking classes. Now, if we look at some of the healer balance, and healer balance has been talked a lot by me and a lot of other guilds, and a lot of guilds already predicted what their roster is going to be like. Now, top-end guilds, top-end players will have multiple healers as a backup. So I'll talk about that later on, but overall, if you look at most of the guild setups, you'll notice that most of the guilds used around 4 healers for majority of fights. Meta ended up using 4 healers for that Mythic Jaina kill with 2 Resto Shamans and 2 Discipline Priests. Of course, damage reduction was extremely strong in those fights. This can provide a lot of damage as well. It was a damage check, it was a Zerg fight. Spirit Link was really strong, Barrier was really strong and things like that. But if we look at other fights, we'll notice that if we start comparing from fights like King Rastakhan, where Shamans or Resto Shamans were kind of stacked as well, because Tremor Totem was able to break out people out of Mind Control if you place it before the Mind Control was used, so it was kind of cool little utility. Resto Shamans were really shining, to be honest, on Megatorque, where I know it doesn't sound like a stacked up fight, but a lot of these Mythic guilds will use strats where majority of the raid will be stacked, and things like Healing Rain, Chain Heal can be really, really utilized. To some extent, Blockade was a fight where majority of the raid DPS were ranged, and majority of them were stacking. And a lot of the guilds actually used not 1 but 2 Resto Shamans for those kills. I think Method used 2 as well. A lot of them use Shamans, and again, I'm presuming that Mythic Jaina is also going to be using a lot of Resto Shamans because there's a lot of stacking, and when you stack Resto, you can't go wrong with a Resto Shaman. There's no way you can go wrong. But overall, if you look at the healer balance, you'll notice that a lot of these guilds were using things like Mistweavers, were using things like Resto Shamans, Discipline Priests, Holy Priests, and a lot of them were using also Holy Paladins. I've been hearing a lot of negativity towards Holy Paladins. Why would you ever play a Holy Paladin that is so low in healing meters? You have to remember that a good Holy Paladin can be a real asset to these World First kills. Just because Meta didn't use a Holy Paladin, it does not mean that they're not good. Keep that in mind, guys. But overall, if we look at the not so good healers, Resto Druids were definitely bottom of the list here. I have not seen a Resto. I think the only guild that used Resto Druid was like for Conclave, and that's because the Mythic mechanic of Conclave requires decurses, or you have to dispel curses, and Resto Druids can do that, while a lot of the other guilds just end up using, like, you know, DPS Druids, DPS Shamans or Mages to just dispel it. So definitely Resto Druids were the most unrepresented healing class in Mythic World First Race, and I feel it's kind of unjustified. I feel like there was a lot of negativity towards happening towards Resto Druids because they had really big nerfs in 8.1. So I feel, in my opinion, that a lot of the healers did not have a Resto Druid as a backup. And Resto Druids were buffed right before Mythic was released. Like a day before Mythic was released. I feel they were strong enough that you could bring a Resto Druid to some of these World First kills, but I feel a lot of the guilds already had made up their mind about which healers they're going to bring and things like that. So don't be disappointed the Resto Druid was not brought in these World First kills. I still feel they're very strong healer even at the top end content. I really do. Now if you look at the DPS, again, I've made a video before about the changes that happened to a lot of the DPS classes. A lot of the DPS were nerfed. And I mentioned at the start of the video that there's no real point looking at class stacking before the last 3 bosses, because the last 3 bosses are, at least they seem like they pose enough threat to promote class stacking. And we saw that. We saw Mega Torque, where a lot of the guilds, Limit Method, Pieces, Exorcist and things like that, just brought like 4 or 5 melee at max. And they brought in a lot of dot classes. And in Blockade, there was an Blockade is one of those fights where if you're a melee DPS, if you're not a Havoc Demon Hunter, you're probably going to be benched unless you're going to outgear the content and you don't need that damage requirement. But Blockade was just insane. That you need to damage the ads, you need to damage the boss. The DPS check is really heavy. Melee can't DPS the ads and DPS the boss at the same time. So you have to bring dot classes. Boomkins, I think most of the top end guilds end up bringing like 5 balanced druids. They brought in like tons of Shadow Priests, tons of Warlocks, a lot of Destruction Warlocks in these top end guilds, some of the Frost Mages. And the mentality, at least it seems like, for the top end guilds is that we're gonna bring a ton of range classes, we're gonna bring a ton of dot classes, but we need to buff those dot classes. We need to bring a Havoc Demon Hunter, or at least we need a Demon Hunter. A Demon Hunter will provide that 5% magic damage increase if they hit a target. So we're gonna need to bring a Demon Hunter. Vengeance Demon Hunters are basically a meme right now in the top end raiding content, so we're gonna bring a Havoc Demon Hunter. And most of these guilds will have, actually all of these guilds will have at least one Havoc Demon Hunter, and it's probably primarily for that 5% magic damage increase. And then they might bring a rogue, maybe a warrior for that battle shout. I know battle shout, you can use the inscription buff, but it's not as good as the actual warrior's battle shout. So that was the general consensus. We're gonna stack dot classes because this is a sweeping statement again. Battle for Dazar'alor is a very dot class friendly raid. Dot classes really shine here. Shadow Priest, Balanced Druids, Warlocks, really strong classes for this raid, and you can see that in the composition of the last 3 bosses. So if we were to talk about some of the MVP classes, and I mean by MVP classes in terms of classes that were perceived as really kind of mediocre or not that great at the start of BfA, and the classes that just emerged to be really strong in raids, I definitely have to mention Prot Paladins. Prot Paladins and Prot Warriors are doing really well. Guilds actually bring them in for world first kills. If you look at healers, Resto Shamans are really strong right now. If you have a mythic, or at least if you have a raid composition that can stack, if there's a boss mechanics that allow for stacking, Resto Shamans were really strong. Resto Druids were kind of falling behind in this tier, but like I mentioned before, I feel that they're more than good enough to be brought in for some of the world first kills. And if you look at some of the DPS, dot classes were really shining. And I guess Havoc Demon Hunters, you always have to have at least one. So thank you guys for watching this video. Let me know how you feel about this Mythic World First race. Let me know if you're happy that Meta killed, or at least got the World First. Did you think Limit was gonna get it? Let me know how you feel about this composition, or this group compositions, class composition. Keep in mind, guys, this is the top 1%. This is the top 1% of players this is most likely not going to affect a lot of people out there. Let me know if you found this video interesting. If you like the content, please do subscribe. It helps out the channel a lot. Thank you guys, and I'll see you in my next video.